Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington for bringing us the speaker this afternoon, Professor Steve Hanson, who is here to talk about the future of Russian foreign policy. This is something that's interested many folks at Microsoft for quite a number of years, both with the BRIC initiative and with other emerging market initiatives. So we've had multiple folks come in and talk about the IC part of BRIC, which is India and China. The BRR is what I'm hoping to do this spring. This is Russia, and then Brazil will, of course, be not least but last. I'm just really, really pleased that Professor Hanson could be with us today. He's actually on sabbatical this year, doing wonderful things, engaging his brain, and doing wonderful lectures. And I was just really, really happy that he was able to take the time to come and speak with us. So again, thank you very much to the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Washington, and please help me welcome Steve Hanson.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation to come speak to you today, and I'm really impressed there's actually this many people, given the kind of day we got. On the way over, we were thinking somehow the mood was just not Russian studies, with all the sun on the mountains and everything. Although, as we'll see, there are some rays of sunshine in Russia these days, so maybe there is some kind of karmic connection. Well, I'm going to try in about 25 minutes or so to outline where we stand in U.S.-Russian relations. And obviously that's a big task because it's a big country, the biggest country in the world still, by far. It's a country that's very difficult to understand. I really think that's true, but possible to understand. It's not just an enigma wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in a riddle, or whatever combination of wrappings you prefer. There is actually a way, I think, of understanding it successfully. But before we can really get to where we are now and the Bush-Putin relationship and its future, I think it's important to take a step back. It's now just about exactly 15 years since the Soviet Union collapsed. Enough time really to think about what the lessons have been of this rather amazing, immense historical transformation that people of my generation in grad school never thought we would see. I went to grad school in the 80s to be a Sovietologist, and I was hired by the UW in 1990 as the last Sovietologist, actually. I got to teach that for 1 year, and then I don't know what I do now, Russia and everything else. So it's been interesting as a career in a lot of ways, as you might imagine. And one of the interesting things about it has been watching the field of Russian studies and also policy predictions about Russia go wrong again and again and again. So I'm going to start off by telling you today, at least an argument I want to make, that 5 straight times the U.S. got Russia wrong in living memory in the last 15 years. Yes? Well, we're going to start with that. So it's equal opportunity critique. Everybody got it wrong, except me. But that's no. I'm just kidding. I got it wrong too on occasion. So here we go. If you look back to '87, you start with Gorbachev sort of at the height of his powers. The typical Sovietologist predicted, and actually a lot of policymakers too, that Gorbachev was going to be triumphant. That the Soviet Union was modernizing, it was becoming a more successful kind of educated industrial power that could cooperate with the United States. We should support Gorbachev against the reactionaries and conservatives who were seen as his major adversaries. As you well know, almost nobody predicted that the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse and would indeed collapse just 4 years later. And in fact, that took people by surprise all the way up through 1991. I remember going to a conference of the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies, the main kind of Russian studies association in the country, in November of 1991. This was after Gorbachev had already been arrested and the coup plotters had failed and Yeltsin had become, really the key actor. And were treated to a keynote address by a famous Sovietologist who claimed that all of this was a scheme to make Gorbachev more powerful than ever. And he would reemerge as a kind of dictator with powers like Stalin. So this was in November of '91. Really quite astonishing, actually. So the first prediction is the Soviet Union will survive, Gorbachev will win, the Soviet Union will become a democracy. And that led to some bad policy choices, actually. For example, George Bush, the older, was in Kiev very famously in the summer of 1991, just as the whole thing was falling apart, and pledging solidarity with the Ukrainian Communist Party, saying we don't want suicidal Ukrainian nationalism to break apart Gorbachev's perestroika. That was our policy message to the Ukrainians in the summer of 91. Kind of didn't go over very well as a speech. Okay, the famous Chicken Kiev speech, it's gone down in history as. All right, well then 1991 occurs, and as you know now, the Soviet Union collapses, and by the end of the fall of 91, that is a changeover to 1992, the U.S. government under George Bush decided that probably it was time to give up Gorbachev, as much as we liked him, and back Yeltsin, who pretty clearly had become the key figure. Now, to be fair, there were good reasons to worry about Yeltsin. He was an alcoholic. We knew that very well. He actually made a tour of the United States in 1988 in which he showed up drunk to many of his public appearances, stumbled through his speeches, and the U.S. State Department and other parts of the U.S. government said, we don't really want Yeltsin in charge of the nuclear arsenal of Russia, because he's actually very drunk half the time, which could be a problem. And so that's understandable. And it really played a factor, actually, in keeping Gorbachev alive in U.S. foreign policy making and keeping Yeltsin down. But finally, by the end of 91, it was clear. Yeltsin was the first and only democratically elected leader of Russia. He clearly was the person that the majority of Russians supported. And he also stood for the breakup of the USSR, even if he didn't quite intend it. Officially, he was supporting Baltic independence and willing to give up the rest of the republics. And so we have a second round of predictions. And what's quite remarkable is right after we decide to back Yeltsin, you start getting this surge of enthusiasm for him under the kind of rubric I've called here Yeltsin the Democrat. And I'd say most Sovietologists and post-Sovietologists, as we were starting to call ourselves, were pretty optimistic in the early 1992 period. I mean, you had not only Yeltsin in power, but a team of young reformers who wanted to create capitalism in Russia, Gaidar, Nemtsov, Chubais, and others who were seen to be very Western in their orientation, a younger generation that would bring about the transformation Gorbachev couldn't. So the prediction again was, success with Yeltsin the reformer in charge. Unfortunately, what you ended up with 2 years later was, in some ways, what you might have predicted, a real problem creating capitalism overnight in Russia, massive declines in gross domestic product, double-digit declines actually for most of the decade of the 1990s, hyperinflation or near hyperinflation, technically just short of the definition of hyperinflation, but inflation rates of 180 times a year for first couple of years of the transition. People losing their life savings as a result of that, as you would expect with inflation. People who had saved up 10,000 rubles, kind of thought of as the equivalent of, say, $10,000 in the U.S., and a fortune from Soviet standards, suddenly that's worth about, a couple dollars by the end of that first few years of transition. And so people are very angry. And that creates political polarization, partly because Yeltsin didn't actually have new elections after the Soviet Union collapsed, but tried to rule with the old Soviet parliament, which in many respects was populated by people who didn't want that kind of a transformation. So you ended up with a near civil war, actually, between Yeltsin and his own parliament, the very parliament he defended against the coup plotters under Gorbachev's rule. And then in October of 93, the decision to shoot the opposition in the parliament using artillery, with over 150 people in the Russian parliament building killed. Now, to be sure, some of the people in that parliament building were also fascists with ugly ideas, and so it's not so easy to just assign blame. But the result was a real serious decline in support for even the concept of democracy in Russia, which was then, after that, perceived a little bit as a tool for Yeltsin consolidating power. And so the notion of Yeltsin just triumphantly introducing liberal capitalism, that was obviously thrown out. Well, by the end of 93, then people finally get very pessimistic. Twice we thought the reformers would win, first Gorbachev, then Yeltsin. And instead we have disaster, collapse of the whole Soviet Union, collapse of the economy, near civil war. And although Yeltsin is able in December of 93 to introduce a new constitution, which is ratified by over 50% of the Russian population, maybe. There's some evidence they kind of bumped it up a little bit here and there to get over the 50% necessary barrier. But, you have a constitution. But still things look bad, because in that very same December election period in 93, the majority votes go to not the majority, but the plurality of votes go to parties like Zhirinovsky's Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, led by a seemingly maniacal would-be dictator who pledges to blow nuclear waste into the Baltic states until they submit and return to Russia, and who says he'll shoot criminals on the spot and also pass out free vodka to everybody in the country. This man and his party received 23% of the Russian party vote in December of '93. The Communist Party of the Russian Federation, led by Gennady Zyuganov, open admirer of Stalin, pledging to restore the Soviet Union in something like the old form, his party ends up with about 15% of the vote. And then other kind of nationalist and fringe parties get a share. So you end up with a parliament that's got a majority or near majority that's not only opposed to Yeltsin and these young Democrats and reformers, but actually is actively interested in restoring Russian empire. And that sends chills up and down the spines of everybody in the West, Zhirinovsky's performance in particular. And you start getting a lot of discussion of this concept of Weimar Russia. In Russian, it's Weimarskaya Rossiya, so it works in translation as well. So it was a debate in Russia, too. And here the idea was, maybe these other predictions of success and reform and transition are wrong. Maybe the proper analogy is Germany after World War I, which, after all, like Russia, was inheriting a decaying empire, suffered a catastrophic decline in its international status, was filled with nationalist conspiracy theories about how somebody stabbed us in the back, maybe Jews, so anti-Semitism plays a role as well in the Russian context. You have would-be dictators, Führers, Hitlers like Zhirinovsky pledging they're going to put Russia back, up from its knees, and economic dislocation that could attract young people to that cause. And so all of these factors together make some scholars think, well, what we're going to get is basically Nazi Germany in Russia, but with nuclear weapons, which would be kind of bad. Actually, it still sometimes scares me, when I think about that, because it's still a possibility. But for 2 years, that's sort of the, I'd say, predominant paradigm. People are saying, we really were wrong to think reform would happen. We really better watch out for the nationalists. It's in this period that now President Clinton decides to do things like expand NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to include eventually now almost all of East Central Europe, the former Soviet bloc, but originally just Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. And the decision is made quite explicitly because you have Zhirinovsky and people like that potentially coming to power in Russia, which would seem to be pretty threatening if you're the former Soviet satellite states. So you have a kind of disillusionment in the West about what's going on in Russia. So what's that prediction like? Well, it turns out by '96 you get something that wasn't expected by anybody. You don't get Zyuganov as president. You don't get Zhirinovsky as president. You get Yeltsin reelected for a second term in '96 under the constitution that he adopted in December of '93, and roughly in a free and fair manner. Roughly. I mean, we can't go too far down that path. There are irregularities. There's media manipulation. There's some money from billionaires going into Yeltsin's advertising campaign. Oh, and by the way, a few billion from the U.S. IMF diverted into Yeltsin's reelection campaign as well. So we did our part. Suddenly, glossy magazines show up in everybody's mailboxes throughout Russia that depict Zyuganov and the Communist Party as would-be Stalins with pictures of the Gulag. And so, I mean, there's money behind Yeltsin, but there's money in every democracy behind the winner. In case you didn't know that. So, it's a roughly free and fair election, and I can tell you all of my Russian friends I talked to, they voted for Yeltsin. Almost all of them. Some voted for Zyuganov, but most voted for Yeltsin. And the reason they did is they said the opposite choice would have been a disaster. So we picked Yeltsin. Yeah, we know he's a drunk. We know he's sick. We know he's kind of a little bit out of control, but better than the alternative because at least we have some freedom. And so he gets reelected to a second term, and everyone in the West says, whoa, this is crazy. This is what we predicted earlier. We didn't get Weimar Russia. We got the reformer Yeltsin and his capitalist supporters, the young reformers, the same people before back in office. And so things are going to be great. We made it through the Weimar Russia threat. So prediction number 4 is I love this book, came out in '96, The Coming Russian Boom, which came out just late enough that stacks of it in Barnes & Noble were just lying unsold. I felt very bad for these people because, actually it turned out they were right a little later on, but wrong in '96 to '98. So this 2-year period, again, you get incredibly optimistic predictions about Russia's future. If you said in this period, and I can tell you from personal experience, gee, this economy is running up enormous budget deficits. It's not really collecting taxes, so there's really no macroeconomic stability here at all. And they're basically funding themselves by selling increasingly high-interest state bonds with shorter and shorter periods of maturity. which were then bought up by everybody in Russia and recycled 3 months later. I mean, at the height of this, you had 100% interest rates on 3-month government bonds, which is either the best investment you ever made or the worst investment you ever made. You know, and it's kind of funny in retrospect that didn't clue everybody. It's weird. You'd think everyone would say, well, this is down the toilet in a couple minutes. Right now, what's the U.S., we talk about collapse in the U.S. What's our 30-year bond? 4.5%? We're not near collapse. Just compare the statistics. But anyway, people thought there was a boom. And actually, the Russian stock market in 1997 was the best performing emerging market in the world in 97. So money came flooding in. Hot money. Money that could flood out again when the inevitable occurred, which was default on Russian debt and a devaluation of the ruble, which actually in about a week lost 3/4 of its value in August of 1998. And all the Western investment quickly went the other direction, and you had another double-digit decline in GDP and threats of higher inflation. People lost their savings again because all the banks had invested in these short-run monetary instruments, which were now valueless. And so people who just gotten their trust back in the Russian banking system now once again lost everything. And so then you get the last prediction I'll talk about here, which is the Russia is finished prediction, again taken from a headline in the Atlantic Monthly that appeared a little bit after this, 2000. 1999 to 2000, you couldn't find anyone to say a good word about Russia's future in the United States. Almost anyone you spoke to said, you know, this country is nothing but a bunch of thieving mafiosis. They have no technology. Haven't you seen the James Bond movie, The World Is Not Enough? You know, this is a depiction from this period where Russian generals basically sell you ICBMs for tennis shoes. That's the picture in people's minds. Still in people's minds, still to this point. When I talk to, you know, audiences not as educated as this one about Russia, because I think you guys know a lot, you talk to ordinary folks and they still think Russia's declined, you know, double-digit GDP declines for the last 6-7 years. So the prediction of Russia is finished ended up, I think, being a pretty long-term one for American public opinion. You know, after this decade of crazy change no one could follow, the conclusion was Russia we can write off. And guess what? That prediction was just as fallacious as all the others. In fact, it was just like the others, 180 degrees wrong. It was precisely in 1999, after the devaluation of the ruble, that the coming Russian boom actually occurred. And every year since 1999, Russia's GDP growth has been between 5% at the lowest to 8-9% at the highest, averaging about 7%. You know, Putin came to office in 2000 pledging to double Russian GDP in 10 years, and everyone said, it's another Soviet-style plan, they'll never make it. You know, to double your money in 10 years, you need 7% a year. They'll miss it, but not by that much. Not by that much. So yet another bad prediction. Now, here's a tiny, tiny bit of social science theory, which I'll just give you 30 seconds, because I know that's everyone's level of tolerance. But you know, it's a puzzle, isn't it? It's kind of weird. Why would we be wrong 5 times in a row, and not just a little bit wrong, but dead wrong, exactly backwards? If you made all your investment decisions by going against Sovietological wisdom, you'd make lots of money. You know, stay out, go in, get out, come in spades. You'd make money. That was what you should do, right? Now, a little bit, that's just the old buy low and sell high conundrum. And yet still, I think there's something more systematic about that there's something wrong with us, that we can't figure out anything about the country. So let me try to give a quick answer to why I think it is the case that we've been wrong, and why Putin is different, and hopefully it'll help us understand him. Okay. So the basic reason I think we've been wrong is that we are used to analyzing countries with stable institutions. So we're used to looking at countries, and I would include here, by the way, India, China, and Brazil. We're looking at the BRIC countries. Most of the countries we deal with have something like stable political orders. If we define institutions as authoritative and standardized rules of the game, you know, not just any old rules that you make up to, you know, meet for poker, but some authoritative rules that people know are there, that have a kind of history to them. The key test is, do you feel a duty to obey the rules, and not just an interest in doing so? If you feel a duty to obey the rules, you've got an institution, and if it's just convenient to do so, or you don't want to get in trouble, you don't have an institution. Would be the social science difference. And in this former sense of being authoritative rules, Russia doesn't have any. Since the Soviet Union collapsed, a country that did have institutions, oppressive institutions, but it had authoritative rules, you've had a Russia that hasn't been able to invent any new rules of the game that ordinary Russians feel a duty to obey. I mean, they're going to pay their taxes because no one wants to get in trouble, and people want to do the right thing in Russia like anywhere else. But the rules are not seen as authoritative. They're seen as playthings of the elite. They're seen as manipulations from unnamed sources. They're seen as things to evade and erode if possible, because institutions are bad news. They tend to get you in trouble. They don't create much, if anything, in the way of public goods. If that's right, that the main problem for Russia is that it still hasn't developed authoritative institutions, then maybe these kind of gyrations here are not so surprising. When you have a multinational empire that included 280 million people, collapse overnight in 1991, and 15 new states out of nowhere are created that never existed before in history, including Russia, which in the Russian Federation territory has no precedent, it might make sense to expect that there's going to be not just a year or two of transition to democracy in the market, but decades and decades, maybe centuries, sad to say, of confusion, dislocation, and really difficult times inventing authoritative institutions that people can believe in. And when you have no authoritative institutions, over the course of a decade or two or three or more, what ends up happening is people find ways to survive that are informal. They find ways to get ahead that don't involve playing by the rules, but instead involve connecting with friends you trust, involve finding a clever way to manipulate the rules in your favor, finding assets that are fungible, like oil, gas, diamonds, or timber that you can sell quickly and make a bundle on. And when that happens, you don't get either stable democracy and capitalism, but you also don't get stable fascism or totalitarianism. And that's very important. So you never get the worst case scenario that's predicted by the doomsayers, but you also don't get the happy scenario. You get perpetual uncertainty, and in a way it's a vicious cycle, because as Russians face a future that still looks uncertain when it comes to what the formal rules of the game are. When you ask Russians, will the Constitution of '93 exist for the next election? Will Putin stay on as president in 2008? Who knows? Who has any idea? Will George W. Bush stay on past 2008? No. The answer is no. The answer is no. I'll bet you money. And that matters, right? I really will. I'll bet you $100. Beyond that, I don't. No, I'm just kidding. I'm joking. All right, so let's get to Putin, because that's enough social science theory. It took 5 minutes. So who's Putin, and how does he solve this problem? Well, first of all, he doesn't really solve it. Putin comes to power in 2000. At the time Russia's supposed to be finished. He's already benefiting from the rebound in the Russian economy that I described earlier. And he immediately benefits from something as a new leader in Russia that is still very important, and that's simply the contrast with what happened in the 90s. Not only has the economy finally started to grow again after a decade of double-digit declines, about half of Russia's formal GDP disappeared in the 90s. It's probably overstating the case, because some of what disappeared was, fake Soviet statistics and military production no one wanted. But still, it was a serious decline. So Putin comes to power as the rebound is occurring. Has nothing to do with Putin, actually. It's very lucky for him that he came in at this point, because now all Russians who don't study economics or social science say Putin equals good economy, and Yeltsin equals bad economy. So that's one factor. Another is personal. He doesn't drink. He drinks some beer. In fact, he complains in his autobiography that when he was a spy in East Germany, he got very addicted to beer, and so that's why he has to fight the problem of weight gain from drinking beer. Although, as you see on TV, he's a judo black belt and not a fat guy at all. So the point is that he drinks a little bit, but nothing like Yeltsin, who actually went on television frequently completely drunk. Yeah?
Question with this analysis.
Huh?
If it's correct, then the country can decompose into fighting militias.
Well, let me get to that at the end. And the worst case scenario, I will conclude by saying the worst case scenario is still there. It's still on the table. It's not as likely as it once was, but it's still there. I agree with you. But how do we get from here to the end? So basically, Putin comes to power, and people say he's younger. He's healthy. He doesn't drink so much. And he's very competent. He is a person who can make a good showing. He can answer questions for 3 hours in a press conference with minute factual details. No problem. Just people phone in. Yeah, the questions are screened in advance. It's not that much of a miracle. But nonetheless, 3 hours, he sits there and he answers questions in detail, and there's some very funny jokes thrown in. He is an amazing... By the way, that really matters. When you have a leader, especially compared to Yeltsin, because Yeltsin is an embarrassment of biblical proportions. Yeltsin made Russia's image permanently scarred in the world, which no one will ever forgive him for. And Putin, is serious, whatever you think of him. Even his spy past is part of his charisma, not a contradiction to his charisma in Russian culture. He's seen as a guy who can get things done because the KGB, or FSB as it's now known, was a competent institution. It actually had some ability, unlike the party bureaucracy. And so he's a guy who came with a bunch of advantages culturally, personally, and economically, most importantly. But did he invent institutions? Didn't he suddenly solve this problem of post-imperial confusion and uncertainty? I think, and this is my argument, I don't think Putin has any more idea than Yeltsin how to solve that problem. And maybe it's not even solvable. Where authoritative institutions come from in politics and economics is a very thorny question. If we only study very successful countries like the United States or China, we're not going to answer that question very well. Now, how about US-Russian relations? If you accept this story that I've given you so far, and it's a debatable interpretation like all interpretations, but it implies that the United States and the West in general have quite an opportunity in 2000 when Putin comes to power. A very serious opportunity. Because you have somehow managed to avoid the worst case scenario so far of either disintegration of the country or fascism. You have a president who says he wants to be part of the West and makes that pretty explicit. You have a Russian population that's very cynical about any political ideologies of the right or the left, and basically would just like to have, still, a normal life, as the saying goes. And then in 9/11, you have a Russia that's decided officially to side with the United States in the war on terror. Putin, as you may know, was the first president of any foreign country to call the United States after 9/11. It made a huge impression on George W. Bush. Bush had met Putin, before in the spring in Slovenia, already had a good impression of him. That's where he famously looked in Putin's eyes and got a sense for his soul. By the way, the moment he said that, I had just finished this first version of this talk. And so I knew the next prediction was Putin as strategic partner. And, you could predict from that. Oh, well. So there was this call, and he used the hotline that we'd established with the Soviets back in 1963, because we have still a hotline because of nuclear potential disaster. So Putin called Bush and said, "We're with you." And it was a serious choice. I mean, there were people in Russia, in the military, for example, who said, Osama bin Laden's our ally. Anything that takes down the bastard U.S. that destroyed our country and killed our economy and pretends to help us with economic advice that ruins our country. So there were people out there who wanted to take a different position in the war on terror, but Putin said, no, we are with you because we've been dealing with the scourge of terrorism from Chechnya and in Moscow, and we've been dealing with the clash of civilizations with Islam. In many ways, Putin's version of the war on terror is very similar to George W. Bush's. They see it quite similarly, even in religious terms, one might say. Now, Putin himself may not really be that religious. He wears a cross that his mom gave him, and he famously told Bush about it in Slovenia. So that's a debate about how serious he is. But at least the framing of the war on terror is quite similar in the two countries. As a kind of crusade, which occasionally slips. Oops. No, not like that kind of crusade. Just like a good cause. I didn't mean crusade. I'm sorry. Anyway, but in both countries, you get that kind of slip. You also get the accompanying danger of loss of civil liberties, loss of democracy, torture of the people you don't like, and all that's very similar. So the point is that Putin comes to Bush at a vulnerable time after this history, and I think it was a last shot. I really think it was a last shot for the United States to do things right and say, okay, Putin may not be exactly our idea of a democratic leader, and maybe they're not going to promote shock therapy reform anymore, but at least they're calling us and saying we're on your side in the war on terror after 9/11, which is a pretty serious attack on the U.S., So what did we do in return? Let me list 6 things quickly. By December, we tore up the Abm Treaty, the one remaining piece of arms control architecture with Russia, which Putin had over and over said was the most important thing that still stabilized our relationship in the strategic arena. Abm Treaty restricted missile defense to a system in Moscow for the Russians and a system in Grand Forks, North Dakota for the U.S., if you didn't know about that. In Grand Forks, they still have it, all these big dishes that look out there and employ, I think, most of the population of North Dakota is just employed there. There isn't much of a population of North Dakota. So. Okay, so we violated the Abm Treaty. We said we needed to build missile defense, so forget it. And in June, we signed the Treaty of Moscow, which says both sides will cut down to something like 2,500 nuclear warheads by 2010, unless we decide not to. I'm not even exact. The whole treaty is 3 pages long. It's the shortest arms control treaty in history. And it says you can store any warheads you want. It doesn't count. And in 2010, you can give 3 months' notice that you're not going to do it. So that was the first step. Right after that, there was the State of the Union address in January of 2002, which would have been a great time for Bush to stand up and say, Putin has taken a risk, stands with us in the war on terror. We stand with the Russians. Let's work with Russia to integrate, in the new world against this scourge of terrorism. Actually, Russia never came up in the speech until the very end, when he said, we are working in new ways with Russia, India, and China. At which point I said, oh my God, you don't understand. You can't say that. Everyone in Russia will say, you're just lumping us in with the third world. We made a pledge to support you in the world, the war on terror, and what we get is this. Instead what you talk about is the axis of evil. Iran, Iraq, North Korea, all our allies. You're going after our allies instead. So another missed opportunity. Right after that were the Winter Olympics, which is an appropriate topic for today, 4 years ago, in Salt Lake City. So again, we have an opportunity to do something symbolically, because Olympics are important in world opinion and in Russia in particular. And what we get is a triumphant opening ceremony where we celebrate the U.S. victory over the Soviet ice hockey team in Lake Placid with all this wonderful anti-communist symbolism. The team comes back. Did you watch this 4 years ago? And so the opening ceremony was celebrating the U.S. victory over the Russians in the Cold War. And then there was a big ice skating scandal where the Russian, ice skaters were forced to share their gold medals with the Canadians. President Putin himself went on television in Russia and said, North American judges are not objective when it comes to our Russian athletes. We get in a trade dispute over chicken exports to Russia and steel exports to the United States, which becomes very bitter. And as a result, we do not waive the Jackson-Vanik Amendment of 1974, which was passed in the Cold War to say we won't have trade relations with the Soviet Union unless they allow free immigration, which made a lot of sense when Senator Jackson, our namesake at the Jackson School, pushed that in 1974. But it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the 2000s, at a time when anyone who can leave Russia does, and millions have left. There's no problem with free immigration. We still have the Jackson-Vanik Amendment on the books. Congress refuses to waive it because they always find some pretext. Now it's human rights. The problem is that we never waived it after 15 years of an effort to do something. Russians can say, quite legitimately, for 15 years we tried to create democracy and capitalism, and you basically left our country in the tank. China has a communist party dictatorship, and you invest hundreds of billions of dollars and call it the next superpower. So we draw our lessons from that about what you really mean when you say you care about world democracy. And then Iraq. So after all of these kind of things that could have gone differently, symbolic steps like State of the Union or Olympics, and practical steps like not waiving the Abm Treaty and the chicken steel trade dispute and Jackson-Vanik, any one of which would have made a difference at a critical time, but all of which went against the Russian perspective, we end up with the war in Iraq, which, as you know, alienated most of public opinion in many countries in the world. And Russia was no exception. And it really was, I think, probably the end of the line for the romantic period Putin did have for a while, in which he thought working with the United States in the war on terror might be a practical strategy that could bring Russia back into the international community in a way that would work. By the Iraq War, very few people in Russian elite circles, certainly nobody in the Russian military, and very few even intellectuals were pushing for that. And since the Iraq War, the dominant discourse in Russian public opinion toward the United States has been that it's a power that, it's not like it's bad. I mean, people still support Americans as a people. 2/3 of Russians say they like Americans as a people. It's not anti-Americanism in some really, deep sense. But as a country, the United States is now seen as the biggest threat to Russia in most public opinion polls. There's incredible cynicism about American promises, about American democracy, about human rights, about any kind of principle you can think of. And so now we have a real problem dealing with Putin's Russia, because that moment, that window of opportunity was lost, I think, and now we have a Russia which is very, very paranoid when it comes to global opinion. At the same time as its economy has given it the power to do a lot of things in the military arena and a lot of things in its neighboring states that could be potentially a real problem in the years to come. So where do we stand now? Well, the title of my talk was Russia, Strategic Partner or Evil Empire. It's sort of a polemical question. And the strategic partner part I just talked about. Now what you're getting increasingly in US circles is a feeling that Russia really is actually the evil empire. Ever since this 9/11 window passed and both sides have become hardened in kind of mutual distrust, we see increasing signs that Russia is going down a very dangerous path. The richest man in Russia, Khodorkovsky, was thrown in prison, and the biggest country in Russia dismantled, Yukos. The state, the Kremlin, grabbing more and more of the natural resources of the country, basically to make sure that that important instrument remains in state hands. The television stations coming under state control and increasingly parroting the Kremlin line. Independent journalists finding it more and more difficult to operate. The elections in 2004 to re-elect Putin were something of a farce, much more so than previous post-Soviet elections. This time, Putin won with over 70% of the vote in the first round, and his nearest competitor was in the mid-teens, so he didn't really have much of a competition. The Russian parliament, the Duma, is filled with 4 parties that do basically what the Kremlin asks. One party that sometimes is in opposition, the others have given up, more or less. I have to go quickly, so I have to exaggerate a little, but it's pretty true. And you have Putin as the one source of political authority in the entire country now. And Russians still, not maybe loving him quite the way they did originally, but still supporting him, again, because the alternatives seem bad and the West and Europe seem threatening. So where are we going in the future with this? I think we're in dangerous territory. Because the big problem of creating new institutions in Russia hasn't been solved by Putin. Just because he's competent and sober doesn't mean the institutions function. In fact, ordinary Russians are no more willing to see the state's institutional rules as something to obey as a duty than they were under Yeltsin, I would argue. There are efforts to do that now. Putin is doing his best to create a kind of youth culture of patriotism, to support the notion that obeying the state's rules is something spiritual, not just practical or worth doing. He's even created a youth group called Nashi, our guys. I don't know, it's hard to translate, but our people. And trying to get young Russians to go to summer camps where they hear patriotic speeches from Kremlin officials and then will go volunteer is the idea. But it won't work. And it won't work because Russians are perfectly aware of exactly the manipulation that's going on and don't care to be patriotic in this fake sense. Economic growth is good and a sober president is good, but joining some communist-style summer camp where you repeat the latest political technologist statements from the Kremlin is no one's idea of a fun time. So we have, I think, a Kremlin which is increasingly paranoid about the global environment, especially after pro-democratic revolutions in Ukraine and in Georgia and an attempt at one in Kyrgyzstan, distrustful of the United States, distrustful of the EU, growing economically, likely to grow for quite a while, not sure of what Russia's role in the future is. And that brings us to 2008. So let's see if we can make a prediction. Since all the predictions are always wrong, let's see if we can do any better given all of this background, and then I'll stop. 2008 is supposed to be when Putin steps down as president. That will be the end of his second 4-year term. The Constitution of Russia is still the Yeltsin Constitution of December 93 that I told you about. It says you get 2 terms as president and that's it. So the debate in Russia now, as you might expect, is what does Putin do in 2008? Putin has been asked about this question repeatedly. Every press conference he gives, one person raises his or her hand and says, Vladimir Vladimirovich, we would really love you to stay on. You're so wonderful, but are you stepping down or not in 2008? That's how you have to phrase the question, by the way. And Putin says, I have no intention whatsoever of staying on. It's unequivocal. There's no way. Someone asked him last week or 2 weeks ago, would you maybe want to be the head of the Gazprom monopoly, the natural gas monopoly? He said, I don't see myself as a businessman. He was asked once, well, what kind of role would you play after 2008? He says, I will find my place in the ranks. And he's doing it on purpose, by the way. There's this kind of weird, it sounds like he's going to step down, and then there's these strange hints that he won't. And that is the problem. In other words, we said George W. Bush will step down in 2008. I'll bet you $100. I won't bet you $100 about Putin in 2008. In fact, I'll bet you $10 that he stays on. Only 10, because it's very, very unsure. But I think he'll probably stay on. What I will predict with 100% surety, 100%, so I'll bet you all my money, is basically what that would imply logically, is that there won't be any stable institutions in Russia in 2008. The Constitution of 93 won't matter, the Duma won't matter, the federal rules won't matter, the economic rules barely matter. The rules of companies matter because they can set their own rules to some extent and they can piggyback on the international system. But the rules of Russia itself are still extremely uncertain. And that means, by the way, I promise I'll stop here. It means that we're still potentially in this window of opportunity, even though we kind of blew it after 9/11. There was a big window then, but there'll be another window. And the reason there'll be another window for the West to do something better than we did last time is that there's still no constituency in Russia for fascism, except a small minority of youth. There's some skinheads out there who'd like to go beat up people of Caucasian nationality, and they do so, or they stab people in synagogues. But like any country has that, including the United States. It's not by any means the dominant opinion in Russian public opinion, and it's not the dominant opinion even in the Russian elite. It's a highly cynical elite and a pretty cynical population. So we have to keep thinking, how do we bring Russia back into the world system? You can't just expand NATO and the EU and say it's over. You can't even just bring Russia in the WTO and say it's over, although that would help. We have to think a lot more creatively about the biggest country in the world with thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons that we thought was finished in 2000. And if you have any suggestions as to what we should do, let me know. So thank you very much for your attention. I left about 15 minutes for questions. Should have been more. Hi.
Sorry to be disagreeable.
Oh, please.
But I have a conjecture why Scientologists were wrong.
Yes.
Or Russologists.
Or even the new ones, yeah.
Yes. Because they have political agenda.
Uh-huh.
The way you describe the current crisis with Russia is due to Bush. And I think it's wrong. It's about 150% wrong.
Which part of it? Because
97% wrong.
Which part, though? I'm not quite sure what you mean.
I will not speak long. I think there's a much simpler picture, very common. I'm not social studies expert, but I read newspapers. Russia went through authoritarian regime and chaos. Authoritarian regime and chaos. And that always happens. When people get tired of authoritarian regime, especially intelligentsia and rich people who think they hate it, eventually they sort out, and then chaos, and then people discover chaos is even worse.
Right.
Okay. Now, so that explains much more, I think.
It's sort of similar to what I said, actually, in a lot of ways.
Now, when the romance started, let's see, suppose you're Putin. You want to build that country around war.
Right. Right.
So you build it about, you have still an empire. Right? You don't have Kazakhs, you have Tatars and Bashkirs and so on. You have an empire. You have to build up this empire. It's very difficult to build an empire which doesn't have enemies. So empire builder needs enemies. I think whatever happens, very little depends on Bush. So maybe he made a mistake.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he kept spelling that Putin is his great friend, and so on, and there are other. So I think all these little things could be patched up, you know, and in the meantime, Russia builds a nuclear plant in Iran.
Yeah.
Which is a completely crazy place.
It doesn't make a lot of sense to do that.
Yes.
So let me try to, just because I want to make sure other people have a chance to ask something, and I think I understand the thrust of your question, though we can talk later, too. I mean, I don't disagree, actually. Part of this is a question of what you squeeze into one 30-minute talk, and I think that the angle of the United States is both interesting to some American audiences, but also, I would argue, an important, not decisive, but important part of the story. In other words, the U.S. misunderstanding of Russia, which I chronicled, and doesn't disagree too much with your own version, I think, leads to some incredibly short-sighted decisions. For example, the decision that the way you make a strategic partnership with Russia is calling Putin your friend, and that's it. So no change on trade policy, no change on arms control, no change on symbolism, just Putin is my friend. And Putin says it to you too, which is nice. He comes to the ranch and he says, George Bush is my friend. So, it's a very wonderful friendship they have. But I laugh because it's ridiculous on both sides. I mean, anyone in Russia or the U.S. would laugh at that kind of notion of geopolitics. And that's what we're left with. Why it matters is, don't you agree? I mean, there are a lot of young, and for that matter, every Russian, who is trying to figure out what Russia's place in the world is right now. And there was a notion earlier, Europe is it. U.S. is terrible. During the Iraq War, this became very popular because you could stand with the Germans and the French against Bush, But then it turned out the EU was really critical of Russia's behavior in Chechnya and constantly criticizing human rights violations in Russia and calling Putin an autocrat. If anything, the Europeans are more likely to do that than the United States under Bush. We don't do it as much. Then people say, well, maybe the United States is our friend. But yeah, they totally ignore us. They still think we're a bunch of mafiosi. They know nothing about our culture or our history. They think that they won the World War II. The United States lost 250,000 people in World War II, which is very significant, horrible, it should be commemorated. And Russia lost 25 million. The Soviet Union lost 25 million people. So these kinds of disparities are just not understood. So, well, you know, it can't be the United States. Well, is it China? I have Russian friends who say maybe China's the future. But then they immediately say we have culturally nothing in common. And by the way, they're going to take over all of Siberia because they have 1 billion people and we have 140-something million and declining. So there's nowhere for Russia to go. And that matters. It matters enormously because it creates that image of enemy. It makes it easier for Putin to say, you know, we have to watch out because some people out there are trying to take a juicy morsel of our country, which was, he said, because we're a nuclear power, and somebody decided that we should weaken it. That's a quote from President Putin after the Beslan hostage taking. You know, the school kids who got taken over by the terrorists in September of 2004. All right, other questions. We can talk forever, I'm sure.
I just wanted to make a little remark about, you said that it's really hard to plant patriotism in Russians, and I completely agree. Russians are really cynical about all the ideology now, but what I think the propaganda is really successful of is planting some xenophobia through all this mass media, and that might be some weak substitute to patriotism issues.
I actually really agree with you. I mean, this is the same, in a way, the same thrust of argumentation that what's going on in Russia, and I guess I'm saying it too, that after this missed opportunity. See, my argument is that it was not, again, decisive, but a factor, that after 9/11 there was no embrace of Russia, when there really could have been one. And it could have been done on Western principles, but it wasn't done. And as a result now, you get a kind of increasingly distrustful, not just Russian government under Putin, but Russian public, who say, you know, I mean, by the way, in the last 5 years, when I go to Russia, and I go all the time, I give a lecture. It used to be I was just Steve Hanson from the University of Washington to give a lecture. Now I'm always an American. The first thing people say is, you American pointed, you know, and then the assumption is someone's paying me to say whatever I say because, you know, I have a scheme to do something bad to Russia. And I never felt that before in the 90s. I feel it now. So, I mean, you know, I'm not saying America controls the whole world and, you know, America's all important. I'm saying it's something. I mean, it's still the most powerful country in the world. And so, you know, this kind of problem. So you're probably right. So xenophobia is a weak substitute for patriotism. I like your formulation. I may steal it. Though you'll have to get credit because it's all being recorded, so I'll get your name later. Yeah.
What do you think about the tendency of the Russian government right now to make national champion businesses in various sectors, and what do you think that means in terms of the political direction and also its impact on global business?
This is a great question. The whole, you know, Putin, the strategy is quite clear by now to everybody, which is, you know, and it's more or less been said explicitly. Use whatever, either raw material companies, oil, gas, nickel, and so on, and maybe even auto, you know, heavy industries, possibly merge them, create some kind of 1960s style French planification, you know, where you have not Soviet style central planning, but you know, national champions, as you say, or the Japanese model. And there's several reasons why it probably won't work. Most importantly, the bureaucracies are totally corrupted. So unlike Japan or France or these earlier examples in the mid-20th century where you had fairly serious civil service traditions, and you could also hire people out of universities who believed in the country and the patriotism was real and all the rest. In Russia, what you're going to get is a lot of thieves. You know, so if you can merge 3 auto companies and somebody has the access to the overseas account, you know, it's pretty likely that that person will find a way to. And Putin is well aware of that, talks about it constantly, but his solution to it is to create these youth groups and you know, make the media have patriotic themes and so forth. So it doesn't really work. So the bureaucratic material isn't there to do that. In terms of the global economy, the timing is all off because in the 60s, you know, there was a point at which you were competing largely in heavy industrial goods, you know, producing cars or appliances. And now you guys are the ones who know better than anybody, but I mean, the world has moved on. And so if you imagine sort of a national champion of, I mean, imagine how Microsoft would function if George W. Bush decided it's the national champion. So we're going to start sending orders from Washington, D.C. about, you know, what kind of software you'll produce.
Isn't that already happening?
I'll leave that for you. I don't know. I'll leave that for you. But the point is, it would not be a good thing whether it does or doesn't happen. It creates a real bureaucratic nightmare for all the people who would otherwise be the cutting edge of the global 21st century economy. So it's completely off. And this is just a sad fact of Putin's life experience. I mean, Putin perfectly sincerely believes that state ownership of the economy is the way to go. And he believes it because he looks at the Soviet Union, which was a global superpower where the state owned 97% 6% of the economy. He looks at China, like I said earlier, and says, you know, the shock therapists came here and told us to break out, to make privatization and break up the state economy, and we've sunk for 10 years. And look at China. They have a strong party and state, and they grow. So there's a kind of set of bad assumptions that he makes, which lead him to the conclusion the state should re-centralize everything. And he's doing it. Final point. If you want, you can buy Gazprom stock now, and you can invest yourself on this strategy. If you'd like to do it, the stock has been soaring over the last year. The Russian stock market last year went up 84%. Our own university called me up, and I went and consulted with them because they said, should we invest in Russia? You know, we sort of missed the boat. They went up 80%. And I'll bet much more on institutions' presence or absence. I don't know. So the strategy is there, and they can get some global support for it, which matters. You raise a lot of capital. So the optimistic story is Russia becomes something like a fairly efficient big raw material exporter. Saudi Arabia, but with better kinds of state monopolies. They get a ton of foreign investment, just like all the big producers of oil and so forth. And it goes in a small number of hands, but enough that it trickles to some cities of Russia. And that's okay. I mean, Russians will say, hey, it's better than collapse and chaos. So maybe it actually is a stable strategy.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that with Hodorkovsky was that he was trying to actually sell Yukos to Exxon.
Right.
And that was one of the mistakes when the privatization happened, is that there was no limits on foreign ownership. And I think it's kind of understandable that you don't really want your major oil company to be owned by your company.
Well, we did the same with CNOOC. When CNOOC tried to buy Unical, we had the same.
So I mean, I think it's not really credited that. I think it's understandable that Putin would block the trade. But maybe how it was done was an unusual effort.
The whole problem with Khodorkovsky, I think, is pretty straightforward, which is not that you couldn't go after oligarchs, because they all broke rules and, you know, they ordered hits and the whole thing. The problem was everyone knows that everybody did that in the 90s. There's not a single person who didn't. So everything depends upon what principle you want to use. And Putin had the chance to use the principle, most corrupt, most thieving people, we'll arrest them. But he didn't use that principle. He used those who go against me. And that changes the whole calculation for everyone else in the economy. It means the way to get ahead and make sure I'm still a billionaire in a few years' time is to kiss you know where. So I'll buy the Fabergé eggs, and I'll bring them home to Russia. This is a real example. I'll bring some Fabergé eggs from Britain to Russia and put them on display in Moscow. Vexelberg did this. And that shows you're a very patriotic oligarch. And you believe in Russia and its future because you brought the Fabergé eggs. It's incredibly cynical. Yeah.
So I'm seeing this kind of interesting, two interesting things going on. One is that Chechnya really doesn't want to be part of Russia, and it's trying very hard to be one of the breakaway republics like all the stands in Georgia and so forth. In the meantime, Lukashenko in Belarus is. I think if Putin asked if he'd, join the Russian Federation tomorrow, probably the following day it would happen. So why not just, take Belarus and let the
let Chechnya go
and call it a wash?
Oh, complicated question. First of all, I have to quarrel with your premise a touch. So two things on Chechnya, which I wish I could do a whole lecture. It's incredibly important, complicated issue. Right now, the situation is that the official word is the war's over. Chechnya has been reincorporated into the Russian Federation. There was a referendum on a new constitution for Chechnya, which passed overwhelmingly. There were elections for the Chechen parliament, supported the Putin candidates overwhelmingly. Of course, all the others were disqualified from the ballot, but nonetheless. And now you have the Chechen leader who is Chechenizing the war. I mean, they use the word Chechenization of the war, of the conflict with the terrorists, not a war anymore. So basically you have a kind of pro-Kremlin Chechen gang in charge of Chechnya who go out and they make sure that people's heads are cracked if they oppose the Chechen regime and the Putin regime. What that does is it creates more Islamist opposition in the rest of the North Caucasus. So people have been moving from Chechnya to Dagestan or Kabardino-Balkaria or Ingushetia or the other neighboring regions. And the problem is spreading, becoming more radicalized, but not so localized as in Chechnya. Now, the object of the opposition isn't so much independent Chechnya anymore. It's more global caliphate. And that was the product of 15 years of this kind of... I mean, in '94, it was all about being independent when it started. Yeah, I won't go there, but So that's one part. Belarus is another trick, because Belarus costs enormous amounts of money to subsidize all the free oil and gas Russia keeps sending it, and still does, even though they raised the rates to Ukraine and so on recently. Belarus still gets it, and it's a big issue for Putin and others. They don't want to reincorporate with Belarus if it's going to mean subsidizing this bastard Lukashenko who, doesn't exactly do what Putin wants. On the other hand, it's a very useful thing to be able to say we have an ally in Europe, and Lukashenko is our person, and Belarus is one with Russia. So both of those issues are much more complicated than they sound. Why not just go for the Belarus solution, get rid of the Islamic areas? Because they're all interpenetrated. Populations intermingle all over the borders of these places. Russian populations, Chechen populations, Ukrainian populations in all of the countries. So there's no clear, it's true throughout the world, by the way. There's never a clear dividing line where you just say, like a game of Risk. Here's Ukraine, here's Yakutia. So I'm not making fun of your question, by the way. It's just Risk occurred to me, so I went with it. Okay, I think that might be all the time we have, or can I do one quick one? Because I think there was one back.
Yeah. My question was about investments from the United States, for example. You have mentioned that the United States invest in China and lately heavily in India. So the sense I get from you is because of the stability in those countries.
Right.
So I wonder how much stability India has over Russia. Do they enforce law more, or?
Well, India, number one, is a democracy, and that matters because you do have some kind of mechanism for transfer of executive authority, which has worked, right? I mean, we've gone back and forth between Hindu Nationalist Party, Congress Party, different prime ministers, and so you don't have the 2008 problem. You don't have, will Putin stay on? If he stays on, does it just become like Turkmenistan? Do we end up with a really corrupt dictatorship or the evil empire? Or do we get chaos if we have new elections? So that kind of problem has been solved in India. The middle class is freer in India by far to just engage in the global interactions that they need to do without government approval. Partly because it's such a huge country, approaching 1 billion people. It's much harder to patrol, and the Indian state is weaker. Ironically, it's easier to get around the state in India because the Russian state's only 140 million people over this vast territory, and it's a pretty powerful state. Now, for investors, here's what the debate is. I can't tell you what I would do because I don't have enough money to matter. But when I talk to investors, they say, we can't help but be impressed with Putin over the 90s. When we lost everything in '98, a lot of people were very scarred, shut down their Moscow offices and said, forget it, never again. Now they see year after year of 7% growth. They see a confident Putin. They don't know a whole lot necessarily about all these institutional dilemmas, nor do they have to, because they're looking at a global chessboard of investment opportunities, and they're thinking short run. What's my quarterly performance or my annual performance at most? I'm not saying investors never think long term, but in the short run, if the stock market goes up 87% in a year and you were part of it, you go, oops, I invested in Enron or something instead. So they have to weigh that, right? The stability factor versus this kind of continuing sense that the political situation in Russia is messed up because there is no democracy and things are too arbitrary and the state will make its decision. I think that this gas war with Ukraine that just happened in January was a terrible blow to Putin's reputation. The argument that all of the pro-Kremlin people were making at investment seminars was, you can trust us, the state. We're going to run the natural gas and oil companies in a way that will be clear and predictable. It's not going to be like those robber barons who just do crazy things. And people bought it. Okay, that makes sense. The state will run things more successfully. And then they decide on national television to turn off the gas spigot to Ukraine, to punish Ukraine for not, basically for lots of things. That's a whole different lecture. But the amazing thing was putting it on TV, having people sort of turning the pipe as a kind of, this is the xenophobia thing, showing we can stand up to Ukraine in the West. But for an investor, you're looking at that and saying, you just told us the state would run the natural gas, in a kind of clear and transparent way. So I think there could be a ton more investment. There's actually more and more because the economy's growing. There's opportunity. IKEA, the biggest selling stores are in Moscow now. They've got IKEA in all the big Russian cities. Now you go to the cores of places like Nizhny Novgorod or Vladivostok even, places that were just no growth at all for 10 years. And you see these kind of chain stores emerging and the buildings are getting repainted and spruced up and people are driving really nice cars and dressing much better than Americans. And so it's very difficult to convey the complexities, and I'll end on this. It's very difficult to convey the complexities. Russia is complicated. The moment you hit a stereotype, you get it wrong. The moment you say, oh, I've got it, it's Putin dictatorship. Well, it's kind of part of the truth right now. But you will miss an economy that finally turned the corner in '99. And a whole generation of young, confident Russians who now say, hey, we're doing all right. He'll miss the Russia-European connection, which is very important culturally. on both sides. So you'll miss, why the former prime minister of Germany decided to become the second in command at Gazprom. I mean, so there's a bunch of things going on that still give me a lot of hope, because it isn't just dictatorship of the Cold War. It's not evil empire or strategic partner. It's a country in flux 15 years after the collapse, with which great things are possible, but people have to study it and learn about it, or they're going to get it wrong. And that, I guess, on that note.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for all the questions.